The speech concludes by reinforcing a deep sense of confidence rooted in companionship with God. It affirms that the believer does not walk through the day in isolation, even when circumstances feel overwhelming or unclear. This awareness reshapes how challenges are faced, replacing the fear of being alone with the assurance of constant divine presence. The day is approached not with uncertainty, but with trust that every step is supported. This confidence is not built on personal strength or past success. Instead, it flows from knowing that guidance and protection are already in place. The believer is reminded that they are never required to figure everything out on their own. Decisions, struggles, and confrontations are met with the understanding that help is available and wisdom is accessible through faith. The speech highlights that walking with God brings steadiness. When pressure arises, panic does not take control. When obstacles appear, discouragement does not define the response. Confidence grows from the belief that nothing encountered during the day is unexpected or unmanaged by God. This perspective creates emotional resilience and spiritual stability. There is also an emphasis on courage. Confidence does not remove difficulty, but it changes how difficulty is faced. Fear may attempt to rise, but it does not dominate. The believer is empowered to move forward, not because the path is easy, but because it is guided. Courage becomes a response to trust rather than an absence of concern. The prayer acknowledges moments of delay and waiting. Confidence in God's presence allows patience to replace frustration. Instead of interpreting delay as failure, the believer learns to see it as preparation. Waiting becomes purposeful rather than passive. Knowing that timing is part of divine wisdom, the speech also reinforces endurance. Life brings seasons of resistance, fatigue, and challenge. Confidence in walking with God provides the strength to remain consistent even when results are not immediate. The believer does not give up easily because they are not relying on temporary motivation, but on enduring faith. Another layer of confidence comes from identity. Knowing that one is not abandoned or forgotten brings assurance. The believer moves through the day aware of being supported, valued, and seen. This confidence influences behavior, communication, and decision-making, creating a calm authority rooted in trust rather than control. The prayer affirms that victory is not always loud or immediate. Sometimes it's simply remaining standing, remaining faithful, and remaining hopeful. Confidence in God's presence allows the believer to measure success differently, by faithfulness rather than outcome. Through this declaration, the believer steps into the day with peace, courage, and assurance. The knowledge that God walks with them transforms uncertainty into confidence and challenge into opportunity, shaping every moment with purpose and trust. The speech places meaningful attention on the work and labor of the day, recognizing that daily effort is more than routine. It is an extension of purpose. The prayer invites God's hand over every task, assignment, and responsibility, acknowledging that human effort alone cannot produce lasting fulfillment. By asking for divine blessing on work, the believer recognizes that productivity without purpose can lead to exhaustion, but work guided by God brings meaning and impact. The prayer emphasizes that blessing is not limited to large achievements. Small beginnings, simple tasks, and unnoticed efforts are all placed before God. The believer asks that even what seems ordinary be multiplied and used for something greater. This perspective removes the pressure to prove worth through results and replaces it with faithfulness in the present moment. Favor is also requested in spaces where resistance once existed. Work environments can be challenging, filled with competition, misunderstanding, or unfair expectations. The prayer asks God to create opportunities where none seem possible and to shift atmospheres in ways that human effort cannot. Favor is not portrayed as entitlement, but as alignment, being positioned where purpose can flourish. Wisdom is highlighted as essential in work and decision making. Skill alone is not enough without discernment. The prayer seeks guidance to respond thoughtfully rather than impulsively, to choose integrity over convenience, and to remain steady under pressure. Wisdom allows the believer to navigate challenges with clarity and grace. Integrity is presented as a form of blessing. The speech reinforces that success achieved without character is hollow. By asking God to guard motives and actions, the believer commits to honesty and consistency, even when shortcuts are tempting. Integrity becomes a foundation that sustains progress rather than undermines it. The prayer also addresses weariness connected to labor. Continuous effort without renewal can drain enthusiasm and strength. By inviting God into work, the believer seeks renewed energy and motivation. Work becomes less about striving and more about stewardship, doing one's best while trusting God with outcomes. There is also recognition that work impacts others. The prayer implies that blessed labor can become a source of provision, encouragement, and influence. When work is aligned with God's purpose, it extends beyond personal gain and contributes to something larger. Effort becomes service rather than struggle. The speech reframes success. It is not measured solely by recognition or reward, but by obedience, growth, and impact. By placing work in God's hands, the believer releases the burden of control and embraces trust. Results are no longer the sole focus. Faithfulness becomes the priority. Through this prayer, work is transformed from obligation into opportunity. The believer steps into the day confident that their labor is seen, guided, and sustained by God's hand. The speech emphasizes the deep need for guidance, recognizing that direction is just as essential as protection. Life presents constant choices, some small and others life-shaping, and without divine guidance, even good intentions can lead to confusion. The prayer acknowledges that knowing which way to go is often more challenging than taking the step itself, and it calls on God to lead with clarity rather than allowing uncertainty to dominate. Guidance is requested not only for major decisions, but for everyday movement. The speech reflects an understanding that direction is revealed progressively, not always all at once. By asking God to order each step, the believer accepts that the path may unfold gradually. This creates patience in moments of waiting and courage in moments that require action. The prayer also speaks to doors, those that should open and those that must remain closed. Not every opportunity is aligned with purpose, and not every closed door is a setback. Divine guidance protects the believer from paths that appear promising but lead to harm or distraction. When doors close, The speech reframes it as mercy rather than denial, trusting that what is withheld is just as important as what is given. Fear is acknowledged as a natural response when direction is unclear. Instead of pretending fear does not exist, the prayer asks God to replace it with strength. Guidance is not always comfortable. Sometimes it leads into unfamiliar territory. The speech affirms that courage comes not from certainty, but from trusting the one who leads. The prayer also asks for sensitivity to recognize when to move and when to pause. In a world driven by urgency, being guided by God often means resisting pressure to rush. Slowing down becomes an act of obedience rather than hesitation. The believer learns to listen before acting and to wait without frustration. Guidance is also linked to correction. The speech implies that being led by God includes being redirected when necessary. Wrong turns do not have to become permanent detours when divine guidance intervenes. Even mistakes can be realigned when humility allows God to adjust the course. The speech highlights that guidance brings peace. When decisions are made under divine direction, there is an inner confirmation that steadies the heart, even if outcomes remain uncertain. This peace is not based on external assurance, but on spiritual alignment. There is also recognition that guidance shapes character. Being led by God develops trust, discernment, and obedience. The believer grows not only in direction, but in depth, learning to rely less on impulse and more on wisdom. By asking for guidance, the believer declares dependence rather than independence. The day is no longer navigated alone, and choices are no longer made in isolation. Each step becomes an act of trust shaped by faith rather than fear, and directed by purpose rather than pressure. The speech turns inward to address the condition of the mind and heart, recognizing that many of life's greatest battles are fought internally. Before circumstances change, the inner world must be strengthened. The prayer acknowledges that fear, anxiety, disappointment, and unresolved pain can quietly influence thoughts and decisions if they are left unaddressed. By inviting God's hand over the mind and heart, the believer seeks peace that stabilizes emotions and clarity that guards thoughts. The prayer speaks directly to anxiety, understanding that worry often arrives early in the day, attempting to dictate mood and perspective. Rather than allowing anxious thoughts to dominate, the believer asks for divine calm to override mental noise. This is not denial of reality, but a conscious choice to let peace take precedence over panic. The mind is reminded that it does not need to carry every concern alone. Healing is another central theme. Emotional wounds may not always be visible, but they influence reactions, relationships, and confidence. The speech acknowledges pain that has been buried, disappointment that has lingered, and heartbreak that has not fully healed. By placing these wounds before God, the believer opens the door for restoration. Healing becomes a process of release, allowing what hurt to lose its power over the present. Forgiveness is also woven into this moment of inner restoration. Holding on to past offenses can quietly drain strength and clarity. The prayer invites God to help release resentment, not because the pain was insignificant, but because peace is more valuable than holding on to hurt. Forgiveness is presented as freedom rather than obligation, a choice that lightens the heart. The speech also addresses negative self-talk and doubt. Thoughts have the power to shape belief and behavior. When the mind is unguarded, discouragement can settle in and distort identity. The prayer asks God to replace these destructive patterns with truth, confidence, and reassurance. The believer is reminded that their worth is not defined by failure, delay, or comparison. Inner peace is portrayed as a protective force. When the heart is settled, external chaos loses its ability to overwhelm. The speech emphasizes that peace does not mean the absence of problems, but the presence of stability. With a guarded heart and a calm mind, the believer is better equipped to respond wisely rather than react emotionally. The prayer also acknowledges weariness. Emotional exhaustion can accumulate over time, especially when burdens go unshared. By asking God to restore strength, the believer admits limitations and receives renewal. Rest becomes spiritual as well as physical, replenishing the soul. Through this focus on the mind and heart, the speech reinforces that transformation begins internally. When peace governs thoughts and healing strengthens emotions, the believer steps into the day with clarity, resilience, and renewed confidence. The speech begins by establishing a posture of surrender, recognizing that the day ahead is not something to be controlled, but entrusted. Inviting God's hand over the day is an intentional act of faith that says, I will not lead myself today. It acknowledges that while plans may be made, strength, wisdom, and safety ultimately come from God. The morning becomes a sacred moment where the heart is aligned before the world begins to pull in different directions. Placing the day in God's hands means yielding every moment, both expected and unexpected. It is an admission that human understanding is limited and that divine oversight is necessary. This surrender is not weakness, it is spiritual clarity. It recognizes that without God's covering, even the smallest task can become overwhelming, and with His presence, even the heaviest burden becomes manageable. Inviting God's hand is also an act of trust. It declares confidence that God cares about details, not just outcomes. The conversations, the decisions, the timing, and the interruptions are all brought under His authority. Rather than reacting to circumstances, the believer chooses to respond from a place of alignment, knowing that God's hand steadies what might otherwise feel chaotic. This invitation sets the spiritual tone for the entire day. Before fear can speak, before pressure can rise, before distractions compete for attention, God's presence is acknowledged as primary. The mind is reminded that it does not have to figure everything out at once. The heart is reassured that it is not walking into the unknown alone. There is peace in knowing that guidance is already in place before the first step is taken. Allowing God's hand to rest upon the day also means releasing control over outcomes. It means letting go of anxiety about what might go wrong and embracing faith in what God can make right. The believer does not deny challenges, but chooses not to be ruled by them. Trust replaces tension. Dependence replaces worry. Faith becomes the foundation for every action. This surrender reshapes priorities. Instead of rushing ahead, there is sensitivity to divine direction. Instead of forcing doors open, there is patience to wait for the right ones. The day is no longer driven by urgency alone, but by obedience and discernment. When God's hand is invited, purpose governs movement rather than pressure. Inviting God's hand over the day also reinforces identity. It reminds the believer that they are not self-made, self-sustained, or self-protected. They are covered, guided, and upheld. This awareness brings confidence without pride and humility without fear. The day becomes less about striving and more about abiding. In this surrender, the believer steps forward with assurance, knowing that whatever the day holds, God's hand has already gone ahead. The speech places strong emphasis on the need for protection that goes beyond human awareness, acknowledging that not every danger announces itself. There are threats we recognize and prepare for, but there are also unseen risks, moments, situations, and encounters that only divine insight can intercept. By asking for God's protection, the believer admits that vigilance alone is not enough and that safety ultimately comes from a higher covering. This prayer recognizes that life unfolds in environments filled with uncertainty. Roads are traveled, decisions are made, and interactions occur without knowing what could have gone wrong. Protection is not only about surviving visible challenges, but being preserved from situations that never fully materialize. God's hand is requested to stand between the believer and harm before harm even takes shape. The speech also highlights protection from plans formed in secrecy. Not every threat is physical. Some are emotional, relational, or spiritual. Words spoken with hidden intent, decisions influenced by manipulation, or pressures designed to weaken resolve are just as dangerous as visible obstacles. Divine protection guards the heart, the mind, and the spirit, ensuring that what is meant to derail purpose does not succeed. There is also an understanding that protection is active, not passive. God's covering does not remove responsibility, but it reinforces confidence. The believer moves forward without paranoia or fear, trusting that God's presence goes ahead to block what should not reach them. This kind of faith replaces constant worry with steady assurance. The prayer calls for protection within everyday spaces, homes, workplaces, streets, and relationships. It asks that accidents be prevented, conflicts diffused, and misunderstandings corrected before they escalate. Protection becomes woven into ordinary moments, transforming routine activities into divinely guarded experiences. Protection is also requested over relationships and conversations. Words have power to heal or harm, and without discernment, a single moment can create lasting damage. The speech asks God to filter speech, soften hearts, and prevent unnecessary conflict. This form of protection preserves peace and guards unity. Spiritual protection is another core element. The speech acknowledges that discouragement, fear, and doubt can quietly infiltrate the mind. God's hand is asked to block these influences before they take root. Instead of allowing negative thoughts to shape perspective, the believer is shielded by truth and confidence. The prayer reinforces that protection does not mean a life without challenges. It means a life where challenges do not have the final word. Opposition may arise, but it will not succeed. Pressure may come, but it will not crush. The believer remains standing not because of personal strength, but because of divine covering. Trusting in this protection allows the believer to move freely rather than cautiously. Faith replaces fear. peace replaces anxiety, and confidence replaces hesitation. The awareness that God is guarding both the seen and unseen transforms the way the day is approached, turning uncertainty into assurance and vulnerability into strength.